They called her worthless. They stripped her name from the palace rolls, dragged her through the courtyard in front of every ranked wolf who had ever watched her heal, and told the kingdom that an Omega without standing had no business touching royal blood. She believed them. For 2 years, she disappeared, rebuilt herself in silence in a village that didn't know her shame, and swore she would never again offer her hands to people who saw them as tools. Then the Alpha King's son began to die. Not from battle, not from a curse anyone could name. Something was moving through the boy's body like a slow, deliberate fire. And every silver-blooded healer, every moon-blessed physician, every ancient wolf the kingdom could summon looked at the prince and had no answer, until someone made a suggestion so humiliating it was almost funny. Add the rejected Omega Maid. What no one in that palace knew, what even she had not yet fully understood, was that the illness destroying the prince had a shape she recognized. It wore the same shape as what had been done to her. What lives inside a wound that was never allowed to heal? And what happens when the only person who can save a dying prince is the very person his family tried to erase? Chapter 1. The Girl with No Name Left. The mortar was older than the cottage, older probably than the village itself, and Sarah had learned to work with its one cracked edge rather than fight it. She pressed the pestle down in slow circles, grinding dried bracken moss and silver root into a paste the color of storm clouds, and tried not to think about the way the morning felt wrong. It had felt wrong since she woke, and she had lived in Eldon's Crossing long enough to trust that feeling, long enough to know the difference between the ordinary wrongness of a hard day coming and the specific, cold wrongness of the past reaching forward. The cottage was small, which was how she liked it. 1 room, 1 window facing east. A hearth she kept meticulously clean, shelves lined with jars that the villagers had stopped asking about after the first winter. They knew by now what she could do. They didn't need to understand how. Old Nate, the miller's father, had come to her 3 months ago, unable to lift his right arm. She'd spent 6 sessions pressing her hands against the knotted muscle along his shoulder, feeling for the old injury buried underneath, the one he'd taken 20 years ago and never properly treated. And by the 4th session, he'd started crying without knowing why. By the 6th, he could raise his arm above his head and had no idea what to do with the feeling. "You're strange, girl," he'd told her, but the good kind. She had held that sentence for a long time afterward. Strange, but the good kind. It was more than she'd been given in a long time. She set the mortar aside and uncorked a small clay jar on the shelf above the hearth. Inside, a dark paste, ash mixed with powdered helen root and her own specific formula, caught the morning light with a faint shimmer. She touched 2 fingers to her left wrist, to the place where the marks lived, and applied a thin layer. The relief was immediate. The low, persistent ache she'd stopped noticing because it was always there, quieted. She called it the remembering. The villagers thought it was grief salve, and she let them think so, because the truth was harder to explain. The truth was that 2 years ago, someone had put something in her body that had never fully left, and this compound was the only thing she'd ever found that kept it from spreading. She didn't fully understand the mechanism yet. She understood only that it worked, and that she'd built it from instinct and desperation in the first weeks after they threw her out, shaking and sick in a roadside inn, teaching herself to survive something that should have killed her. The knock at the door came just as she was recorking the jar. She knew before she opened it that it wasn't a villager. Villagers knocked differently. They knocked apologetically, the way people do when they're about to ask for something that feels too large. This knock was precise, official. She opened the door. The man standing on her step wore a traveling cloak with the palace's emblem pressed into the clasp at his throat, a wolf's head, silver on black. He was perhaps 50, with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, currently experiencing the discomfort of not being that. He held a sealed letter. She looked at the seal. She recognized it. The Alpha King's crest. "They found me." She kept her face still. "I don't accept palace correspondence." "This isn't a request," the man said. "It's a royal summons. Refusal carries—" "I know what it carries." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come inside. You look like you've been riding since yesterday." He had. She could smell it. She set water to boil and did not offer him the good chair, and while he settled his uncomfortable bones onto the stool by the window, she turned the letter over in her hands without opening it. "Who sent you specifically?" she asked. "The King's Council." "Does the Queen know you're here?" The pause before his answer was exactly the length she expected. "The summons comes from the King," he said carefully. "There it is." She opened the letter. The words were formal, bloodless, the language of official desperation. The prince was ill. Every healer had been exhausted. Her name had been brought forward as a last resource. She was to present herself at the palace within 3 days. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the man. "Tell me the symptoms," she said. He blinked. "I'm not a healer. I wouldn't—" "You've been in the palace for months while the prince has been sick. Yeah, you've heard things." She held his gaze. "Tell me." He told her. And Sarah went very, very still inside. The fever that didn't behave like fever. The way it moved. Not settling in one place, but tracking a specific path through the body, joint to joint, following the nervous pathways like it knew the road. The marks on the skin. The way it resisted everything silver-based. She had heard these symptoms before. She had felt these symptoms for 3 months in the worst year of her life. She picked up the letter again and folded it precisely. "I'll come," she said. The man exhaled with visible relief. "Not for the king," she said. "Not for the palace. I'll come because a boy is sick, and I may be able to help him." She met the man's eyes. "That's the only reason. Do you understand the difference?" He nodded, though she could tell he didn't. "Not really." She turned back to her shelf and began selecting jars. She packed the remembering compound last, tucking it into the innermost pocket of her satchel, close to her body. She didn't look back at the cottage when she left. She had learned 2 years ago not to look back, but she pressed her fingers once against the doorframe as she passed through it. The way you touch something you're not sure you'll see again. They called you worthless, she reminded herself, walking toward the road. Remember that. Remember it when they smile at you and use your name like they're doing you a favor. You know what you are. Don't let them tell you again. Ahead of her, 3 days' ride away, a prince was dying of something that wore the shape of her own history. She didn't know yet whether that meant she could save him. And she knew only that she was the only one who could try. Chapter 2. They don't send messengers twice. The palace road was exactly as she remembered it. Wide enough for 2 carriages side by side, lined with silver-barked trees that the old king had planted 3 generations ago. Beautiful in the way that powerful things are beautiful, deliberately, as a statement. Sarah rode beside the envoy, whose name she had learned was Earl, and did not speak unless he spoke first. He seemed grateful for the silence. He had the look of a man who had been given an unpleasant task and completed it successfully, and wanted nothing more than to stop being involved. She understood that feeling. They arrived at the palace gates as the afternoon light turned the stone walls the color of old honey. She had forgotten how large it was. Or perhaps she had not forgotten. Perhaps she had simply spent 2 years teaching herself not to remember. The gates opened without ceremony. No one came to greet her. Earl dismounted and handed his horse to a stable boy without looking at Sarah. "Someone will come for you," he said, and walked away with the relieved pace of a man who had already mentally left the situation. Sarah dismounted and stood in the outer courtyard with her satchel over one shoulder and waited. She counted to 40 before a woman appeared, young, sharp-eyed, wearing the pale gray uniform of the palace's medical staff. She stopped 3 feet away and looked Sarah over with the careful blankness of someone who had been told to keep their opinions off their face. "You're the Omega healer," the woman said. "I'm the healer," Sarah said. "All the rest is just rank." The woman's careful blankness flickered. Then she turned. "Follow me." The servants' entrance was around the east side of the building, narrow and shadowed, and Sarah walked through it without comment because she had expected it. What she hadn't expected was the kitchen. The woman led her through it as the fastest route, and the kitchen was full of the evening shift, steam and noise and the smell of roasting meat. And it stopped, not all at once, in pieces, a pot set down, A ladle lowered, heads turning. Sarah kept walking, kept her eyes forward, but she felt them, the ones who looked away quickly, the ones who didn't. An older woman near the bread ovens, stout, gray-haired, with flour on both forearms, went completely still when Sarah passed. Her mouth opened. Sarah met her eyes for 1/2 second. Not now. Oh, she thought. Please, not now. The woman closed her mouth, pressed one flour-dusted hand briefly to her chest, like a small salute or a small apology. Sarah looked away and kept walking. The prince's chambers were on the 3rd floor of the east wing, and she heard him before she saw him. Not crying, not calling out, just talking. Low, irritable, the voice of someone arguing with their circumstances and losing. The sharp-eyed woman knocked twice and pushed the door open. The room was large and dim, the curtains drawn against the late sun. It smelled of medicinal smoke and something underneath that. Something Sarah's body recognized before her mind did. A faint bitterness, almost metallic. There you are, she thought, and her stomach tightened. The prince was sitting up in bed, which she suspected he'd been told not to do. He was perhaps 16, dark-haired, pale in a way that had nothing to do with his natural coloring. He had the bone structure of someone who would eventually grow into a formidable face, but right now he mostly looked exhausted and angry about it. He looked at her the way she'd expected him to. Not cruelty, exactly. Dismissal. The reflex of someone who had been taught his whole life to sort people by rank before he learned their names. An Omega, he said. It wasn't quite a question. A healer, Sarah said, setting her satchel on the table beside his bed without asking permission. Those are the relevant facts. Everything else is just court politics, and court politics can't fix what's wrong with you. Silence. The sharp-eyed woman made a small noise near the door. The prince stared at Sarah. You're not what I expected. No one useful ever is. She pulled a small lantern from her satchel and lit it, holding it close to his face. Look straight ahead. Don't blink if you can help it. He obeyed, which told her something. Underneath the dismissal was someone who was genuinely frightened and had been pretending not to be for a long time. She examined him with the lantern, then without it. She pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point below his jaw, then to his wrist, then to the inside of his elbow. She asked him to describe the pain in his own words, not the words the other healers had given him, his own. He described it haltingly, like someone translating from a language he barely spoke, like something dragging, like being pulled from the inside, like the worst of it follows a road it already knows. And Sarah's fingers stilled on his wrist, a road it already knows. Lift your left arm, she said quietly. He did, with visible effort. Along the inside of his forearm, barely visible in the dim room, a faint tracery of darkened lines followed the path of the vein. She had the same marks on her own arms, had worn long sleeves for 2 years so no one would ask about them. She lowered his arm gently and took a step back. "Can you help me?" he asked. The dismissal was gone. He sounded his age. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. But her mind was moving fast and cold underneath the word, because she now knew with certainty what she had suspected since Earl described his symptoms on the road. This was not a natural illness. This had been made. Deliberately, precisely, by someone who knew exactly what they were building, because they had built it before. She had been the first version. She turned to the sharp-eyed woman. "I'll need the room cleared for sessions, no observers, and I need a list of every compound the previous healers used." "I'll have to clear that with—" "Clear it," Sarah said. "Tonight." She was given a small room 2 doors down from the prince's chambers. It was better than she'd expected. A real bed, a window, a writing desk. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and pressed her fingers against her wrist without the compound, just to feel the baseline. Still there. Still moving slowly. Someone in this palace, she thought, knows exactly what this is, because they made it. And they made it first for me, and now they've made it again for him. And the question is, why they want the prince dead. The more pressing question is why they wanted me gone badly enough to use the same weapon. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would begin treating him. She would get him well fast enough that he could protect himself. Because the person who had done this to both of them was still here, still inside these walls, still untouched. And Sarah was now the only person who knew it. Chapter 3. The palace remembers her face. She was summoned to the throne room before she had treated him once. Sarah had expected this. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things, by deciding in advance what she would and would not show on her face. The throne room was exactly as she remembered. High ceilings, cold marble, light falling through tall windows in precise columns. The kind of room designed to make people feel small before anyone had said a word to them. Alpha King Garrett Montgomery stood at the far end, and the first thing she noticed was that he looked older. Not dramatically, not broken, just worn in the specific way that long worry wears a person, the way it settles around the eyes and the mouth and stays. As he watched her cross the room, and she held his gaze steadily and stopped at the appropriate distance and waited. "You came," he said. "I was summoned. Others were summoned." Something moved across his face. "They found reasons not to." "I'm not afraid of the palace," she said. It was mostly true. Garrett studied her for a long moment. He had the look of a man assembling something, measuring pieces against each other, trying to make them fit. "You were here before," he said. 2 years ago." "Yes." "You were removed under—" "There were allegations." "There were allegations," she agreed. He didn't flinch from it, which she grudgingly respected. "I reviewed the record last night," he said quietly, "after the council confirmed they'd sent for you." Sarah said nothing. "I want you to know that He stopped, started again. "My son is dying. Yes, that is the only thing I can think about with any clarity right now, but I'm aware that asking you to return here is asking a great deal." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she was going to get, and she knew it. "I'll do what I can for him," she said. "That's why I came." She turned to leave. "Sarah." She stopped, but didn't turn. "Thank you," Garrett said, "for coming back." She walked out without answering, because the honest answer was too complicated for a throne room. Queen Vicky Gutierrez found her in the corridor. Not by accident. Sarah had made it perhaps 20 steps from the throne room doors when she heard the footsteps. Precise, unhurried, the walk of someone who had never needed to hurry because rooms rearranged themselves before she arrived. She turned, and the queen was beautiful in the architectural way of someone who had worked at it for decades until it became effortless. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a smile that reached exactly as far as she intended it to. "I wanted to welcome you personally," Vicky said. Her voice was warm. "The king speaks highly of your instincts." That's kind of him. It must have taken considerable courage to return. The smile didn't move, given everything. Sarah looked at her, directly, steadily, the way she'd practiced in the mirror of the Eldon's Crossing cottage on the nights when the remembering compound wasn't enough and the anger needed somewhere to go. "I came for the prince," Sarah said. "I don't intend to be here longer than necessary." Something shifted behind the queen's eyes, quick as a blink, gone before it fully formed. "Well, of course," Vicky said warmly. "We're all hoping for a swift recovery." She reached out and touched Sarah's arm, light, gracious, the touch of a woman accustomed to touching people as a form of ownership. "Whatever you need, don't hesitate." She walked away. Sarah stood in the corridor and breathed carefully through her nose and did not let her hands curl into fists until the queen had turned the corner. "She knows I'm here." Of course she knew. And she's not afraid. That was the part that mattered. Vicky wasn't afraid of her. Which meant either the queen was confident Sarah had no proof, or she was confident it wouldn't matter if she did. Possibly both. His name, she learned from the sharp-eyed attendant, was Leo. Prince Leo Chambers, 16 years old, firstborn and only child of the Alpha King. And the attendant, Christy, had softened slightly overnight, in the way that people do when they've decided someone is less of a threat than initially assessed. "He had a good night," Christy said quietly outside his door. "Relatively. He slept 4 hours together, which is more than he's managed in weeks." "Did the fever spike?" "Once, around midnight. Came down on its own." Sarah nodded and pushed the door open. Leo was sitting up again. He'd been dressed, or had dressed himself, shirt properly buttoned, hair pushed back, in the obvious effort of someone refusing to look as sick as they felt. He had a book open in his lap that he wasn't reading. He looked up when she entered. "You came back," he said. "I told you I would." "Healers say a lot of things." He closed the book. "Aye, then they look at me for 2 hours and leave, and I never see them again." Sarah set her satchel on the table. "That won't happen." She began laying out her materials, the small jars, the linen strips, the compound she'd spent the night preparing specifically for his stage of the illness. "I need you to take off your shirt." A pause. "Excuse me? I need to see the progression along your spine. You can keep your dignity. I've seen worse, and I'm not interested in your embarrassment. I'm interested in your nervous pathways." She looked at him. "Shirt off, please." He took it off with the stiff movements of someone whose joints ached more than he was admitting. She examined his back in silence. The tracery of darkened lines she'd seen on his forearm continued here, following the spine upward, branching at the shoulder blades. As she pressed 2 fingers gently against one of the branches and felt him go rigid. "That's where it's worst," he said quietly. "I know." She kept her touch steady. "I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do and why, because I think you deserve to understand your own treatment. Is that all right?" A beat of silence, like the question had surprised him. "Yes," he said. "Good." She reached for the first compound. "This is going to feel strange before it feels better. It's going to feel like something moving backward. Don't fight it. Let it move." "What is it?" "Something I made." She began applying it along the first branching line. "Something I know works because I tested it on myself." He turned his head slightly, trying to see her face. "On yourself? Why would you—" "Because I needed it," she said simply. "Hold still." He held still, and she worked in silence for 20 minutes, and somewhere in the middle of it, the rigid set of his shoulders began to soften. Not from relief, not yet, but from something simpler. The specific loosening of someone who has been braced for pain and received instead something that didn't hurt. When she finished and stepped back, he reached for his shirt slowly. "That's the first time," he said. "First time what?" "That I haven't felt worse after a healer touched me." He pulled the shirt over his head. When his face reappeared, something in it was different. Younger, maybe, or just less armored. "What's your name?" "Sarah." "Just Sarah?" "For now," she said, closing her satchel. "Names are earned." She looked at him steadily. "I'll be back this evening. Eat something between now and then, even if you don't want to. A broth if nothing else." She picked up her satchel and walked to the door. "Sarah," she stopped. "Thank you," Leo said. He said it the way his father had, carefully, like someone handling something fragile. But where his father's thank you had felt like an attempt at accounting, Leo's felt like something simpler, like he actually meant it. She left without answering. But in the corridor, pressing her back briefly against the wall, she let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she put it away and walked toward the medical stores to begin taking inventory. She needed to know what compounds were being kept in this palace. She needed to know what else they had made. Chapter 4. The Queen's eyes haven't changed. The medical stores were kept in the lower east wing, behind a locked door that Christy opened for her without question, which told Sarah that either the girl was genuinely helpful or she'd been instructed to appear so. She spent an hour in there. The inventory was extensive, hundreds of compounds, most of them standard, organized by the previous head healer with the obsessive precision of someone who'd needed control over at least one thing in their life. Sarah moved through the shelves slowly, reading labels, lifting jars, smelling contents through stoppered corks. She was looking for something specific. She didn't find it. Not that first evening. But she found something adjacent. A gap. A precise rectangular absence on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, and the kind of gap left by a jar that had been there long enough to leave a ring in the dust and had recently been removed. She looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she memorized its dimensions and walked out. Leo was worse that evening. Not dramatically. Not the sharp cliff drop she'd been watching for. More like the slow ratcheting tightening that happened every few days when the illness reasserted itself, reminding everyone involved who was actually in charge. He was lying down when she arrived, which meant the pretense of being fine had cost him too much to maintain past midday. He turned his head when she came in, but didn't try to sit up. "Don't," she said before he could attempt it. He subsided with visible relief. She worked on him for 30 minutes, a lighter session than the morning, reinforcing what she'd begun rather than pushing further. His breathing evened out. The line between his brows smoothed. Halfway through, he said without opening his eyes, "My mother came to see me this afternoon." Sarah kept her hands steady. "How was that?" "She sat with me for an hour." A pause. "She held my hand and told me everything was going to be all right." Another pause, longer. "She's said that every day for 4 months." Sarah said nothing. "She cried a little," Leo continued. His voice was careful, neutral in the way that wasn't neutral at all. "She's very good at crying at the right moment." Sarah looked at his face. His eyes were still closed, expression composed. He knows something, she thought. Or he suspects. He's been suspecting for a while and has had no one to say it to. Rest," she said quietly. "We can talk when you're stronger." "You sound like you know something." "I know lots of things." She lifted her hands from his shoulders. "Most of them will keep until you can sit up without pretending it doesn't cost you." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face and faded. She packed her materials and left him to sleep. Vicky found her again in the corridor. Sarah was beginning to understand that this was simply how the Queen operated. She didn't summon people to her. She appeared where they were, casually, as if by coincidence, so that whatever she said next could never be described as a formal confrontation. "How is he?" Vicky asked. "Resting." "Improving?" "Slowly," Sarah said. "These things take time." "Of course." The Queen fell into step beside her, which Sarah hadn't invited. "You know, I've been thinking about you since the council told me they'd sent for you." Her voice was conversational, pleasant. "I thought about what it must have been like, these past 2 years, starting over somewhere new." Sarah kept walking. "It must have been very difficult," Vicky continued. "After everything that happened, the allegations, the manner of your leaving. The manner of your leaving, as if Sarah had chosen it, as if she'd packed a bag on a quiet afternoon and strolled out the gates. "I managed," Sarah said. "I'm sure you did." The Queen's voice warmed with what sounded almost like admiration. "You're very resilient. I always thought so, even then." She paused. "Even when I had to make very difficult decisions." There it was. Not an apology, not even close. As a reframe, "I made difficult decisions." The language of someone who had never once considered that what they did was wrong. Only that it had been complicated. Sarah stopped walking. She turned and looked at the Queen directly. Vicky held her gaze with the perfect composure of someone who had never in her life been made to look away first. "Whatever you think you remember," Vicky said, her voice dropping to something quieter, smoother, "I want you to know that everything that happened was done to protect this family." The warmth was gone now, precisely and deliberately gone, so that what was underneath it was visible. "Heal my son. Leave. That's what you're here for. Nothing else needs to be revisited." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "I'm here for Leo," she said. "That's all I'll confirm." She turned and walked away. Behind her, and she heard nothing. No footsteps, no retreating movement. The Queen simply stood and watched her go, which was somehow worse than any response would have been. She couldn't sleep. She lay in the small room 2 doors from Leo's and stared at the ceiling and let herself think the things she'd been keeping carefully at the edge of her thoughts since she'd arrived. Vicky wasn't afraid. Not of her return. Not of what she might remember. Not of whatever the king might ask or find or notice. Which meant one of 2 things. Either the Queen believed there was nothing to find, that she'd been careful enough, thorough enough, that no evidence existed, Or she believed that even if evidence existed, it wouldn't matter, that her position was secure enough, her influence deep enough, that an Omega healer's word against a queen's was not a contest worth worrying about. Sarah pressed her fingers against her wrist in the dark. She thought about the gap on the third shelf, the precise rectangular absence where something had recently been removed. She thought about Leo saying she's very good at crying at the right moment, the voice of a boy who loved his mother and had been slowly, quietly learning that the person he loved was not entirely what she appeared. She thought about the king's face in the throne room, the specific exhaustion of a man who was losing something and couldn't identify what. Get him well, she told herself. Get him well fast enough that he can protect himself. Find the proof before someone moves it. And don't trust the warmth in this palace, but not from anyone, because the last time you trusted warmth here, it cost you 2 years of your life. She closed her eyes. From 2 doors down, faint and irregular, she could hear Leo's breathing through the palace's old walls. The particular uneven rhythm of someone sleeping through pain and managing it, just barely, on their own. She listened to it until her own breathing matched it. Then, finally, she slept. In the morning, she went back to the medical stores. The gap on the third shelf was still there, but now, beside it, there was something new. A single dried herb stem, fallen on its side, that hadn't been there the night before. Someone had been in here since her visit. Someone had come back to check what she'd seen. Sarah picked up the herb stem and turned it over in her fingers. Helen root, the same base ingredient in her remembering compound. She set it down carefully, exactly where she'd found it, and she went upstairs to treat the prince. Chapter 5. What Healing Costs. 3 weeks into treatment, Leo could sit up without it costing him. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have felt like a victory. But Sarah had learned, in 2 years of practicing in a village where people came to her with injuries that had been ignored for decades, that small things were where healing actually lived. The large, dramatic recoveries were just small things accumulated until they became visible. She arrived each morning at dawn and each evening after supper, and in between she prepared compounds, reviewed her notes, and tried not to think about the gap on the third shelf that had not changed since the Helen root stem appeared. Whoever had been in there wasn't moving yet. They were watching. The court was not quiet about its opinions. Sarah heard them the way she heard most things in this palace. Sideways, through half-open doors and conversations that stopped a beat too late when she entered a room. An Omega. In the prince's chambers twice a day. The ranked healers tried everything, and this is what the king resorts to. She's not even certified. She has no guild standing. She has no standing at all. Whatever she's doing in there, it's not proper healing. She let it move past her the way wind moves past a wall. She had spent 2 years building that wall, and she was not going to dismantle it because a court she didn't respect had opinions she didn't ask for. What was harder to ignore was Paul. Paul Delaney was the palace's senior healer, a tall, gray-templed man in his late 50s who had held his position for 20 years and wore it like a second skeleton. And he had been the one to recommend, in the end, that the council send for her, which she'd learned from Christie in an unguarded moment, and he seemed to resent this fact deeply, as though it had been done to him personally. He appeared in the corridor outside Leo's chambers on the 4th morning and waited for her to come out. "I'd like to review your treatment notes," he said. "Good morning to you too," Sarah said. His jaw tightened. "The prince is in my care. Ultimately. Whatever supplementary assistance you're providing, I have a responsibility to—" "He's improving," Sarah said. "You're welcome to examine him yourself and confirm it. I'll share my methodology when I've completed the acute phase and can explain it in full. Right now, interrupting the sequence would set him back." She met Paul's eyes. Unless you'd prefer I stop and you take over. That's genuinely your choice to make." Paul looked at her. She looked back. "Fine," he said, and walked away in the manner of a man who had lost an argument he hadn't expected to lose. What Sarah had not told Paul, had not told anyone, was what the treatment was costing her. She had known it would cost something. She had known since the first time she'd used this method, half delirious in the roadside inn 2 years ago, pressing her hands against her own chest and feeling the illness shift, not disappear, shift, into a form her body could process. Her body could process it because it had already survived it. That was the mechanism. She was not drawing the illness out of Leo the way a poultice draws poison from a wound. She was something more like a translator, taking the illness's language, which her body already knew, and rewriting it into something his immune system could recognize and fight. It worked. It was also slowly accumulating in her. Each session left new marks, faint, barely visible, following the same paths the Helen root tracery had followed 2 years ago when it first moved through her. She applied the remembering compound each night, and it kept the accumulation from spreading, kept it metabolizing slowly, but the compound was not infinite, and neither was she. She had calculated, when she began, that she had perhaps 8 weeks before the accumulation reached a level that would become a problem. Leo had been sick for 4 months. Full recovery at this rate would take 6 to 8 weeks. The margins were tight. She didn't let herself look at them too directly. She simply worked. It was on a Tuesday evening. She knew it was Tuesday because the kitchen sent up a particular stew that Christy had told her only appeared on Tuesdays, that Leo first noticed. He was sitting up, shirt off, back to her, while she worked on the shoulder blade branching that had been the most stubborn section. He had his eyes closed in the particular way he'd developed over 3 weeks of sessions. Not sleep, not quite, more like a concentrated stillness, like he was listening to something the treatment was doing. "Your hands are cold today," he said. They were. They'd been cold since morning. "It's a cold day," she said. "It's not that cold." A pause. "Your hands are always warm." "I noticed because the first time you touched my back, I expected it to hurt and it was warm instead, and it didn't." Sarah kept working. "They're cold now," Leo said. "And you came in this morning and you sat down before you opened your satchel. You always open it first. You stood at the door for 2 years, 2 seconds before you came in." He paused. "Longer than usual." She stilled for a moment, then continued. "I'm fine," she said. "You look tired." "I'm always tired. I'm treating a difficult case." "Sarah." His voice was quiet, not the voice he'd used in the first session, dismissive, ranked, automatic. This was the voice of someone who had been paying attention for 3 weeks and had noticed things he hadn't been told to notice. "I get better every session. Every single session I feel measurably better." He turned his head slightly. You look measurably worse." Silence. "That's not a coincidence, is it?" he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah pressed her hands flat against his shoulder blades and held them there. "The treatment is working," she said carefully. "That's what matters." "That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm giving." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside his window, the palace grounds were settling into evening, the specific gray gold of late autumn light that turned everything soft at the edges. "I don't want to get better at your expense," Leo said. His voice was very low. Something moved in Sarah's chest. She pressed it flat. "You don't get a vote," she said. "You're the patient. Your job is to get well. Let me do mine." She finished the session in silence. When she stood to leave, she was slower about it than she should have been. A half-second lag between deciding to stand and actually standing. The kind of lag that happened when her body was running lower than she was admitting. She got to the door before he spoke again. "I keep a journal," Leo said. "I've been writing down every session, everything you do, everything you say." A pause. "In case you need someone to remember what happened here accurately. Later." Sarah stopped with her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll be back in the morning." She walked out. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes and let herself feel, for exactly 5 seconds, how tired she actually was. He's keeping a journal. She hadn't asked him to, hadn't suggested it, and he'd done it himself because he was smarter than the illness had let him appear, smarter than the palace had perhaps needed him to be. In case you need someone to remember what happened here accurately. She pushed off the wall and walked toward her room. She had compounds to prepare. She had, by her latest count, perhaps 6 weeks before the margin stopped being manageable. She intended to use every one of them. Chapter 6. The thing he says when he thinks she's asleep. The cold snap came overnight. Sarah woke to frost on the inside of her window and the specific bone-deep ache that had started appearing on mornings after heavy sessions. She lay still for a moment, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, methodically, without drama. Left shoulder, both wrists, the base of her spine where the accumulation always settled first. Manageable. She applied the remembering compound by feel in the dark, waited for the ache to soften, and got up. Leo was having a bad morning. Not a regression. She checked immediately, pressing her fingers to his pulse points, reading the illness's movement with the attention of someone who had memorized its rhythms over 5 weeks. Not worse. Just one of the flat gray days that came sometimes. It where the body had been fighting so long it simply couldn't locate the energy to pretend otherwise. He was lying on his side when she arrived, facing the window, and he didn't turn when she came in. "Bad night?" she asked. "Dreamed about running," he said. "Woke up and couldn't." She sat in the chair beside his bed and began preparing the morning compound without speaking. Sometimes that was the treatment. Sometimes the most useful thing she could offer was the specific quality of silence that didn't require anything from him. She had learned this in Eldon's Crossing. Old Nate had taught her without knowing he was teaching her, the way he'd sat in her cottage for the first 2 sessions without saying a word, and she'd understood eventually that the silence itself was part of what he needed. Her permission to not be fine without having to explain it. Leo seemed to understand this too, or perhaps he was simply too tired to talk. She worked for 40 minutes, lighter than usual, following the treatment paths she'd mapped over 5 weeks, reinforcing rather than pushing. His breathing evened out, the rigid set of his shoulders released by degrees. By the end, he was nearly asleep. "Stay," he murmured. Not a command, something much smaller than that. "Just for a while. It's easier when someone's here." "I'll stay until you're fully under," she said. She sat back in the chair and watched him drift. Within minutes, he was asleep. Properly, deeply, the sleep of someone whose body had finally stopped fighting itself long enough to rest. His breathing slowed and steadied, and the line between his brows, which was almost always there, he smoothed out completely. Sarah watched him for a moment. Then the chair was very comfortable, and she was very tired, and the morning light through the frost-edged window was the particular soft gray that her body associated with sleep. And she didn't mean to. She simply closed her eyes for one moment, and the moment didn't end. She woke to voices, low, careful voices, the voices of people trying not to wake someone. She kept her eyes closed, and her breathing even because she was not yet fully awake, and her body had learned, in 2 years of living alone and listening carefully, to gather information before announcing itself. "Shouldn't be here, there'll be talk." That was Christy near the door. "There's already talk." Leo's voice, quiet and careful. "There's been talk since she arrived, yet it hasn't stopped her working, and it won't stop me." A pause. "She works too hard," he continued. His voice was lower now. She had to concentrate to catch it. "You've seen it. Every morning, every evening. Paul walks past and makes his comments and she doesn't react, and I watch her not react and it—" He stopped, started again. "She's getting smaller, not in size, in energy, like something is being taken out of her." Christy said something too quiet to hear. "I know," Leo said. "I know she says she's fine. She says it the same way I said I was fine for the first 2 months. Like if you say it firmly enough, it becomes true." A pause. "She fell asleep in the chair. I noticed. She never does that. She's always controlled, everything measured." His voice was uneven now in a way it hadn't been. She fell asleep in the chair because she's exhausted, and she won't say so, and she's going to keep working until—" He stopped. Sarah heard movement. Careful, slow, the movement of someone being deliberately quiet, then the soft weight of something settling over her. A blanket, drawn up to her shoulders, with the painstaking care of someone trying not to wake her. She kept her breathing even. The movement stopped. Then, closer than she'd expected, just beside the chair, she heard Leo lower himself to the floor, slowly, carefully, with the controlled effort of someone whose body still hurt, but was refusing to let that be the deciding factor. He settled on the floor beside her chair. She heard him exhale. I know you won't let me say any of this when you're awake, he said quietly. So quietly. Now, the voice of someone talking into a space they believed was private. You'll say you're fine and change the subject, and look at me like I'm being irrational. A pause. You're not fine. I know you're not fine. I just don't know how to make you let me say so. Silence. I've been thinking about what you said. That first morning. I'm the healer. The rest is just rank. He let out a small breath. I've been thinking about how long it took me to understand that you were right. How many times I almost... He stopped. My mother used to say that rank was protection, that it told you who was safe and who wasn't. His voice was careful now. I'm starting to think she meant it told her who she could afford to ignore. The fire crackled softly. I don't know what she did to you, Leo said. Before, I know she did something. I know it's connected to why you know this illness the way you do, and I know you're not going to tell me until you're ready, and I'm not going to push. A pause. But I want you to know that I'm not going to pretend I don't see it. I'm not going to be convenient about it. Christie's voice came from the door, barely audible. My lord, you should get back in bed. In a minute. Silence. I told you I'd be sorry about a lot of things, Leo said to Sarah's sleeping face. I meant it. I'm going to be sorry loudly, when I'm well enough for it to mean something. His voice steadied. Get well enough to let me. Sarah heard him get up from the floor, with slow, careful effort. She heard Christie help him back to the bed. She heard the room go quiet. She lay still in the chair for a long time after that, breathing carefully, her eyes closed. The blanket warm around her shoulders. She was not asleep. She had not been asleep for the last several minutes. And the thing moving in her chest was not the accumulation, not the illness, not the familiar ache she'd learned to catalog and manage. She didn't have a name for it yet. She wasn't sure she was ready for one. When she finally opened her eyes, the room was empty except for Leo, asleep in his bed, one hand relaxed open on the blanket. She folded the blanket he'd given her and left it on the chair. She picked up her satchel. At the door, she paused. Get well enough to let me. She pressed her fingers once against the door frame, the same way she'd pressed them against her cottage door in Eldon's Crossing, the morning she left, like touching something she wasn't sure she'd be allowed to keep. Then she walked out into the corridor and went to prepare the day's compounds. Chapter 7. She finds the proof. The medical stores were quiet at midnight. Sarah had learned the palace's rhythms over 6 weeks, the way she'd learned Leo's illness, through patient, repeated attention. The night guard changed at 11. The corridor that ran behind the lower east wing was used by kitchen staff until 10 and empty after. The stores themselves were checked each morning by Paul's junior assistant, a nervous young man named Jesse, who arrived at precisely 7 and left at precisely 7:45. She had a window of approximately 8 hours. She didn't need 8 hours. She needed 20 minutes. She had gone back to the stores 3 times since finding the Helen root stem. Each visit was brief, observational. She was building a picture, not yet reaching for anything. The gap on the 3rd shelf had not changed, but other things had. A different jar, 2 shelves up, had been moved slightly. She knew because she'd left a faint chalk mark on the shelf edge behind it on her 2nd visit, and the jar now sat a 1/4 inch forward of the mark. Someone was accessing this section regularly. Someone who knew which compounds lived here and was checking, possibly removing small amounts, possibly simply verifying that the inventory hadn't been disturbed. She brought a small lantern, shielded on 3 sides. She started at the gap. The ring in the dust was still clear. She measured it again with the small length of cord she'd brought, identical to what she'd measured the first time. Whatever had been here was a standard-sized apothecary jar, the kind the palace used for compounds that required long-term storage. She moved upward, and to the jar that had shifted. She lifted it carefully and held it to the lantern. Standard label, standard contents. A compound used for joint inflammation, common and unremarkable. She unstoppered it and smelled it. Joint compound. But the weight was wrong. She poured a small amount onto her palm and looked at it in the lantern light. Joint compound on top. But underneath, she could smell something the joint compound was trying to cover. Faint. Familiar. the specific bitterness that lived in the back of her sinuses on the worst mornings. The smell that was part of her own body now, metabolized into something her remembering compound could manage. She recognized it the way you recognize a voice you hoped never to hear again. There you are. Her hand was completely steady, and then she restoppered the jar and placed it back precisely where she'd found it, quarter-inch forward of her chalk mark, exactly as she'd found it. She did not take it, did not move it, left everything exactly as it was. Then she moved to the bottom shelf, to the far left corner where the oldest inventory lived. Compounds kept for historical reference, rarely touched, some of them labeled in a previous healer's handwriting from decades ago. Behind the third jar from the left, tucked flat against the shelf wall, was a small sealed container she had not noticed on her previous visits because it had been placed with its label facing inward. She turned it. The label was handwritten. Not the previous healer's handwriting, not Paul's. A symbol she recognized. Not a name. A personal mark. The kind used for private correspondence. Or for sealing personal letters. She had seen it once before, pressed into wax on a document she had not been supposed to see. In a room she had not been supposed to enter, 3 years ago, when she was still an apprentice, and still believed that curiosity was safe. She had seen that mark on a letter on the Queen's writing desk. Vicky's personal seal. Sarah held the container in the lantern light and breathed carefully. The container was small, the size of something meant for personal use rather than broad application. There was residue inside, dried and dark, clinging to the interior walls. The bitterness reached her even through the sealed lid, not a fresh preparation. This was old stock. The original compound or close to it, not the version currently hidden in the joint compound jar, which was newer, more refined. This was earlier work. A prototype, possibly. Something kept as a record or a reference. She kept it, Sarah thought. She kept the original. Why would you keep the original unless you needed to remember exactly what you'd made? Or unless you intended to make it again? She placed the container back precisely as she'd found it, label facing inward, against the shelf wall. She stood up slowly. Her hands were not shaking. She had expected them to shake, and they didn't, which told her something about what 6 weeks in this palace had done to the person she'd been when she arrived. She turned off the lantern and stood in the dark for a moment. Think. She had 2 pieces of physical evidence. A jar of joint compound adulterated with the poison, usable but easy to explain away, and a sealed container with the Queen's personal mark containing residue of the original formulation. Harder to explain away, but small enough to disappear overnight if someone moved it. Neither piece was sufficient alone. Together they suggested a pattern, but suggestion wasn't proof, not against a queen, not with an Omega healer as the one presenting it. She needed corroboration. She needed something that placed the compound in Vicky's hands specifically. Not just in her stores, not just with her seal, but evidence of administration. Evidence of intent. She thought about Leo's journal. She thought about the progressive tracking of the illness through his body, the specific path, joint to joint, following the nervous pathways. A natural illness didn't move that precisely. A natural illness spread opportunistically, and following weakness wherever it found it. This moved like something that had been programmed, which meant someone had administered it in a specific sequence, which meant someone had access to Leo regularly, in a context where touching him or handling his food or his belongings was unremarkable. Sarah walked out of the medical stores and locked the door behind her. She stood in the empty corridor and let the thought complete itself. Who has unremarkable access to the prince, daily, in a context where no one questions what passes between them? His tutors, his attendants, his mother. She went to Leo's room, not to wake him. She stood in the doorway and looked at him sleeping, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the relaxed hand on the blanket, and felt something harden in her with a clarity that wasn't anger exactly. And anger was hot, and she was very cold. Someone in this palace is willing to poison their own child. She had known it intellectually since the medical stores. She knew it differently now, standing in the doorway looking at him. I have to get him well fast enough that he can protect himself, because what I found tonight disappears the moment someone suspects I found it. She pulled the door closed softly. In her room, she sat at the writing desk and opened her notebook. She wrote down everything she'd found, every measurement, every smell, every marking. The chalk mark, the jar's position, the sealed container's dimensions, and the symbol on its label, the date and time. She wrote it in the shorthand she'd developed for her treatment notes, the specific notation system that looked, to anyone who didn't know it, like standard healer's record keeping. She added it to the back of Leo's treatment journal. Then she opened her satchel and took out the remembering compound. She looked at what remained. 3 weeks of supply, perhaps 4 if she was careful. Leo needed 4 more weeks of treatment minimum, possibly 5. She applied the compound to her wrists and closed the jar and put it away. The margins were no longer tight. The margins were gone. She closed her notebook and sat in the dark and thought about what she was willing to spend, and whether she'd already decided, and whether deciding again would change anything. It wouldn't. She had decided in Eldon's Crossing, when she recognized the symptoms Earl described on the road. She had decided before she'd consciously admitted it, which was, she thought, how most real decisions worked. And she blew out the candle and lay down. Get him well, she thought. Find the corroboration. Move before she does. In that order. Chapter 8. The King Sees Her. She was mixing compounds at the work table in her room when the knock came. Not Christie's knock. 2 quick taps, efficient, apologetic. Not Leo's, which she'd heard twice when he'd been well enough to walk the 2 doors down and had knocked like someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. This was a single knock, deliberate, the knock of someone who had decided to come and was not uncertain about it. She stoppered the jar she was working on and opened the door. Garrett stood in the corridor alone, which surprised her. She had not seen him without attendants since the throne room. He was in plain clothes, not the formal wear of a king receiving someone, just a dark shirt and riding trousers, the clothes of a man who had dressed in the dark or hadn't thought about it. As he looked worse than he had 3 weeks ago. Not ill, just further worn. The specific erosion of someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long that the weight had become structural. Remove it suddenly, and they might not know how to stand. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped back. He entered and looked at the work table, the jars, the notebooks, the careful organization of someone who spent a great deal of time here. He didn't sit. He stood near the window with his hands loose at his sides and looked at her with the expression she'd been watching develop across his face for weeks. Not suspicion, something more uncomfortable than suspicion, recognition. "He's better," Garrett said. "Yes. Paul confirmed it this morning, formally." A pause. "He wasn't gracious about it." "He doesn't need to be gracious, and he just needs to confirm it accurately." Something moved at the corner of Garrett's mouth, not quite a smile. "He said your methodology was unorthodox." "My methodology works." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been watching you, these past weeks." He said it without apology, simply as a fact. "I watch most things in this palace. It's a habit of survival, I suppose. You notice things when you're paying attention." Sarah waited. "You come in the morning looking a certain way," Garrett said carefully. "You leave Leo's room looking different, not dramatically, just smaller somehow, like something has been transferred." He met her eyes. "And he looks better every time." The room was very quiet. "What is this costing you?" he asked. It was so close to what she'd imagined him asking, had rehearsed answering, back in the small hours when she couldn't sleep, that for a moment she simply looked at him. "The treatment requires a physical exchange," she said. "I metabolize a portion of what's affecting him. My body processes it. It has a cumulative effect. Is it dangerous?" She considered lying, decided against it, not out of trust, but out of strategy. She needed him clear-eyed for what was coming. "It's manageable," she said. "I'm managing it." "That's not what I asked." "It's the answer I'm giving." He absorbed this the way Leo absorbed difficult things, quietly, without drama, filing it somewhere she couldn't see. "Is there a limit?" he asked. "To how much you can manage?" "There's always a limit." "Are you approaching it?" She held his gaze. "I'll finish the treatment." Garrett was silent for a long moment. Yet he turned to the window and looked out at the palace grounds. The gray morning, the bare trees, the specific winter light that made everything look like an old painting of itself. "I failed you," he said. Sarah said nothing. 2 years ago. He didn't turn around. The allegations, the manner in which, what was done. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort in it. "I reviewed the record. I've reviewed it 3 times now. There was no proper investigation. You were given no opportunity to respond formally. The decision was made and executed before any process could—" He stopped. "I failed you." The words sat in the room between them. She had imagined this moment too, had imagined what she would feel, had expected anger or satisfaction or the complex grief of validation that comes too late. And what she actually felt was tired. "Why didn't you investigate?" she asked. Her voice was even. He turned from the window. His face was the face of a man answering a question he'd been asking himself. "Because the allegations came from someone I trusted completely," he said. "Because I believed I had built my entire understanding of this palace on a set of assumptions that I was not prepared to examine." A pause. "Because it was easier to believe a servant girl had done something wrong than to consider the alternative." The alternative. His wife. He didn't say it. She didn't say it. "I gave you my word," Sarah said quietly. "In the throne room. I told you I needed you to look at what was done to me with the same eyes you're using right now. That you said you gave me your word. I remember. I'm telling you now that the time for that is coming." She held his gaze. "Soon. And when it comes, I need you to be ready to look at something very difficult and not look away." Garrett studied her face. "You've found something." "I found the beginning of something." She paused. "I need corroboration before I bring it to you formally. I need you to trust that I'm not acting out of personal grievance." "Are you?" he asked, not accusatory, genuinely asking. She considered it honestly. "I'm acting out of personal grievance, and because your son deserves to know what's been done to him and who did it." She paused. "Both things are true. I'm not going to pretend the grievance isn't there." Something settled in Garrett's expression, like a door opening. "I appreciate that." "When I bring it to you," Sarah said, "I need you to act on it regardless of how difficult it is, regardless of who it implicates." The silence stretched. "You're telling me to prepare myself," Garrett said. "Yes." He turned back to the window. Outside, the bare trees shifted in a cold wind. "My son," he said quietly. Not a question. Just the words, sitting in the air, carrying everything he hadn't asked yet. Sarah let them sit. "He's going to be all right," she said. "I'll make sure of it." Garrett nodded slowly. When he turned back, his eyes were brighter than they'd been. Not with tears, exactly. With the specific brightness of someone who has been bracing for a long time and has just been given permission to let one thing go. "What do you need?" he asked. "To finish the treatment. To manage what it's costing you. What do you need that you haven't asked for?" Sarah thought about the remembering compound running low, about the margins that had closed. "Access," she said, "to the medical stores, unsupervised at any hour, my own key." Garrett reached into his pocket and placed a key on her work table. She looked at it. "I had it cut this morning," he said quietly, "before I came." She picked up the key and held it. He moved toward the door. "Garrett." She used his name without title, which she hadn't done before. He stopped. "The corroboration I need. It's in Leo's journal. He's been recording the sessions, the progression, his own observations." She paused. "Don't ask him for it yet, but know it exists." Garrett absorbed this, nodded once. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back." This time she answered. Get him well first," she said. "Thank me after." He left. Sarah stood at the work table and picked up the key and turned it over in her fingers. She thought about hope being the most dangerous thing she'd felt in this palace. She thought about being handed a key that had been cut before he'd asked her what she needed, which meant he'd been watching long enough to know. She put the key in her pocket and went back to her compounds. She had work to do. Chapter 9. The Queen's Move. The corroboration came from Jessie. Sarah had not expected it to come from Jessie. She had been building toward it carefully, cross-referencing Leo's journal entries with the illness's progression timeline, mapping the specific dates when he'd worsened most sharply against the calendar of who had visited him and when. It was slow work, the kind that required patience rather than brilliance, and she had been doing it in the margins of her treatment notes so that it looked like nothing more than standard record-keeping. Jessie was Paul's junior assistant, nervous, precise, the kind of young man who arrived at exactly 7 and left at exactly 7:45 and kept his own meticulous inventory of the medical stores because meticulous inventory was the one place where his anxiety became useful. He appeared at her door on a Thursday morning, looking like someone who had not slept. "I need to show you something," he said. His own records went back 14 months. He laid them on her work table with the careful movements of someone handling something that frightened them and explained in a low, rapid voice that he'd noticed discrepancies 6 months ago. Small amounts of certain compounds going missing between his weekly counts. Not large enough to trigger a formal report. Small enough to be explained as spillage or evaporation or his own miscounting. He had recounted 3 times. He was not miscounting. "I didn't say anything," Jessie said. His hands were flat on the table, pressing down slightly. "Because I didn't know what it meant. Because I thought maybe I was wrong. Because—" He stopped. "Because you knew what it would mean if you were right," Sarah said. He looked at her. Young eyes, very tired. "Yes." She looked at his records. 14 months of careful notation. Dates, amounts, compound names. The missing quantities were small, irregular, and they followed a pattern that matched almost precisely the dates she had been mapping from Leo's journal. Almost precisely. Not exactly. There were 3 dates in Leo's journal where he'd worsened sharply that didn't correspond to missing inventory. She looked at those 3 dates. "Who else has access to the stores besides you and Paul?" she asked. Jessie hesitated. "Jessie." She kept her voice even. "Who else?" "The Queen has a standing key," he said quietly. "She's had one for years. It was granted when the prince was born. She wanted access to the nursery compounds. The authorization was never revoked." Sarah looked at the 3 dates. The Queen's standing key. Access for years. Never revoked. The 3 dates when Leo had worsened without corresponding inventory loss were dates when nothing needed to be taken from the stores, because those were the dates she now understood when Vicky had administered directly, during her daily visits to her son, holding his hand, crying at the right moment. The full picture assembled itself with the specific, cold clarity of something that had always been true waiting to be seen. She gathered Jessie's records carefully. "You did the right thing," she told him. He nodded, but didn't look relieved. "What happens now?" "Now I finish treating the prince." She met his eyes. "And then things are going to happen quickly. When they do, I need you to be willing to present these records formally." Jessie swallowed. "To the king?" "To the king." A long pause. "All right," he said. "Yes." She brought Leo his morning session and didn't tell him. She worked in the usual silence, following the treatment paths, and he was better enough now that the sessions felt different. Less emergency, more maintenance. The illness was retreating. She could feel it pulling back the way a tide pulls back, grudgingly, leaving the shoreline changed. Afterward, he sat up easily, which still felt like a small miracle every time. "You look like you're thinking about 6 things at once," he said. "I'm always thinking about 6 things at once." "You look like 5 of them are bad." She glanced at him. He was watching her with the particular attention he'd developed over weeks. The careful, lateral watching of someone who had learned that looking directly at her made her close up and looking sideways let him see more. "How's the journal?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. "Current," he said, "through yesterday." "Good." She closed her satchel. "Keep it somewhere that isn't your room." He was still for a moment. "Sarah. Somewhere only you can access. A person you trust absolutely." Sarah. His voice was different now. Is something happening? She looked at him directly. Something is about to happen, she said carefully. I need you to be ready for it to be loud and difficult, and for people to say things about me that aren't true. She held his gaze. I need you to trust what you've seen over 8 weeks, rather than what you hear in the next few days. Leo looked at her for a long moment. Done, he said simply. She nodded and walked to the door. Are you going to be all right? He asked. She pressed her fingers against the door frame. I'll tell you after. Vicky moved on a Friday. Sarah had not known it would be Friday, but she had known it was coming. Had felt it in the quality of the Queen's silences over the past week, the way she'd stopped making corridor appearances, the way the palace staff had shifted slightly in their behavior, the particular tension of people who have been told to be ready for something. She was summoned to a formal court assembly. Not requested. Summoned. The language of accusation rather than invitation, delivered by 2 palace guards who appeared at her door at mid-morning and waited while she put on her coat. The court assembled in the Great Hall. Ranked wolves, court officials, senior staff, the full architecture of palace authority arranged in its precise hierarchy. Garrett sat at the head of the room. Vicky stood, to his right, composed and grave, wearing the specific expression of a woman performing reluctant duty. Sarah stood in the center of the room alone. The charges were read by a court official whose voice was professionally empty. Forbidden Omega bloodcraft. Deliberate prolonging of the prince's illness to manufacture indispensability. Seditious manipulation of a royal minor, using unsanctioned compounds on the crown prince without guild authorization. She listened to all of it without moving. Paul was called first. He testified to her unorthodox methodology, her refusal to share treatment notes, her resistance to oversight. He was careful and precise, and everything he said was technically accurate and entirely misleading, and she watched him deliver it and understood that he had been given this role, had perhaps been maneuvered into it, and that he believed he was performing legitimate professional concern. 2 other witnesses followed. A kitchen maid who had seen her in the corridor at unusual hours, a guard who had seen her entering the medical stores after midnight. Then Vicky spoke. Her voice was measured, pained, the voice of a mother forced to confront something terrible. She spoke of her fears for her son, of noticing that he seemed worse after Sarah's sessions before he seemed better, of the strange marks on his skin that the other healers hadn't been able to explain. Marks, Vicky suggested, that had appeared after Sarah's arrival. The marks had been there for months before Sarah arrived. Leo's journal said so. 14 months of Jesse's inventory records said so. Sarah stood in the center of the room and let Vicky finish. The court was quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a verdict. Garrett's face was unreadable. She looked at him and found the thing she needed. Not support exactly. Steadiness. He was holding himself very still in the specific way of a man who has been told to prepare for something difficult and is doing it. She looked at Leo. He had demanded to be present. He was in a chair to the left of the assembly, too pale, too thin still, but upright, fully, deliberately upright, and his eyes were on his mother with an expression that had nothing of a boy in it. He had the journal in his hands. She hadn't told him to bring it. He had brought it himself. In case you need someone to remember what happened here accurately. Vicky finished speaking. The court official looked to Garrett for direction. Garrett looked at Sarah. Do you have a response? He asked. Sarah reached into her satchel and placed Jesse's inventory records on the floor in front of her. Then she reached in again and placed her own treatment notes beside them. 8 weeks of documented sessions, compound formulations, progressive measurements of Leo's improvement beginning from the day she arrived. Then she looked up at the court. The prince began deteriorating 14 months ago, she said. Her voice carried clearly in the high-ceilinged room. Jesse Wyatt, the medical store's assistant, has documented missing inventory across that same 14-month period. Small amounts, irregular, following a precise pattern. She paused. 3 dates in that period don't correspond to missing inventory, because on those dates, nothing needed to be removed from the stores. The compound had already been prepared. It was administered directly. Silence. There is a sealed container in the medical stores behind the third jar from the left on the bottom shelf, Sarah continued. It bears a personal seal. It contains residue of the original formulation used on the prints. She held the room's attention steadily. That seal belongs to the Queen. The silence changed. Vicky's composure cracked, not dramatically, not into tears, into something colder, harder, a fury that had been held perfectly still and was now pressing against its container. "This is exactly what I warned of," Vicky said, her voice controlled and sharp. "A rejected Omega with a personal grievance, fabricating my son." Leo's voice cut across the room. Everyone turned. He was standing. It had cost him. She could see it in the set of his jaw, but he was standing, the journal held open in both hands. "My son," Vicky said carefully, "you're not well enough to—" "8 weeks ago, I couldn't sit up," Leo said. His voice was steady. 6 weeks ago, I couldn't walk to the window. 3 weeks ago, I started sleeping through the night for the first time in months." He looked at his mother. "I've been recording every session, every compound used, every conversation, everything." His eyes didn't waver. "Including the dates you visited me and the dates I was worst afterward." The room was absolutely still. Vicky looked at her son for a long moment, and then her composure didn't crack. It simply left, stripped away like a surface that had been applied rather than grown, revealing underneath it something that had always been there and had simply never needed to be visible before. "Everything I did," she said, her voice low and precise, "was done to protect this family's future. A wolfless Omega in the palace's healing position was a weakness this court could not afford. What I did 2 years ago protected what you did 2 years ago," Garrett said. His voice was very quiet. Vicky turned to him. "What you did 2 years ago," Garrett repeated. "You did to a child." The room didn't move. "And what you did to our son," he said. "You did to our son." Vicky opened her mouth. Garrett looked at the guards. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Chapter 10. What was planted, what grew. The days after the court assembly had a strange, underwater quality. Sarah noticed this from the outside, watching the palace move through shock the way a body moves through fever, slowly, unevenly, some parts adjusting faster than others. The staff spoke in lower voices. The ranked wolves who had watched her stand in the center of that room found reasons to look elsewhere when she passed. Paul had not appeared at Leo's door since Friday. Vicky had been moved to the Eastern Tower. Not imprisoned. Not yet. The formal proceedings would take time, the kind of time that palace politics required to protect itself from its own conclusions. But she had been removed from the family wing, removed from access to the medical stores, removed from the small, daily proximities through which she had operated. Garrett had done it quietly, the night of the assembly, without announcement. Sarah had not seen him since. She focused on Leo. He had 4 weeks of treatment remaining. She had recalculated after the assembly, adjusting for the stress the court appearance had cost him. He had stood in that room, and it had set him back 2 days, which she tracked without comment and he accepted without argument. He understood now, fully, how the margins worked. He had stopped pretending otherwise. The remembering compound was nearly gone. She had 3 days of supply left when she told him, not deliberately. It came out in the middle of a session, when he asked why she was being more careful than usual about how she applied the morning compound, and she answered honestly because she was tired, and honesty had become, over 8 weeks, the default register between them. He went very still. "How long have you been short?" he asked. "A while." "Sarah, it's manageable. I'm being careful." "You've been saying that for weeks." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the edges of it. "What happens if you run out before the treatment is finished?" She was quiet for a moment. "The accumulation becomes harder to process. It slows the metabolism. My body manages it less efficiently." "Does it stop working entirely?" "Not immediately." "That's not an answer." "It's the honest one." She met his eyes. "I have enough for 3 more days. The base ingredients for more are in the medical stores. I've had the key for 2 weeks. I just haven't—" She stopped. Haven't what? She looked at her hands. She hadn't made more because making more required acknowledging that she needed it, which required acknowledging how low she'd let herself run, which required sitting with the specific discomfort of having prioritized his recovery so completely that she'd let her own margins disappear entirely, and not being sure how she felt about that, and not having time to work out how she felt because there was always another session, another compound to prepare, another calculation to run. "I'll make more tonight," she said. Leo looked at her for a long moment. "I'll come with you." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." His voice was quiet. "I want to." They went to the medical stores at 9 in the evening. Leo walked slowly but steadily, better than he'd been 3 weeks ago, noticeably better than the day he'd stood in the Great Hall. He carried the lantern without being asked. He held it at the right height without being told, which meant he'd been paying attention to how she worked for longer than she'd realized. She gathered the base ingredients efficiently. Helen root, bracken moss, the specific dried compound she'd sourced from the back of the stores on her first visit, and had been rationing since. Leo held the lantern steady and watched her work and didn't speak, which was the right thing to do, and she noticed it. At the bottom shelf, she paused. The sealed container with Vicky's mark was gone. She had expected this, had known that once the court assembly happened, evidence would either be secured or it would disappear, and she had not been the one securing it. She crouched down and looked at the empty space and felt nothing in particular, because she had already given Jesse's records and her own notes to Garrett's senior advisor 3 days ago, formally, with Jesse present. The container's absence was not a loss. It was a confirmation. Someone had panicked. Panicked people made mistakes. She stood and closed her satchel. "It's gone," Leo said. Not a question. "Yes. Does that matter?" "No." She turned toward the door. "We already have what we need." She prepared the new batch of remembering compound at the work table in her room while Leo sat in the chair by the window. The same chair she'd fallen asleep in weeks ago. He didn't offer to help. He understood that this was precise work and that help would mean distraction. He simply sat and kept her company in the quiet way he'd learned over 8 weeks, the way that didn't require anything from her. When she finished and applied the first dose of the new batch, the relief was immediate and deeper than it had been in days. She hadn't let herself notice how much she'd been managing until the managing eased. "Better?" Leo asked. "Yes." He nodded. He was looking at his hands, turning them over slowly. A habit she'd noticed over the past week, this particular examination of his own hands, as if reacquainting himself with them. The marks on his forearms had faded significantly. Another 4 weeks, and they would be gone entirely. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said. "For the treatment?" "For you." He looked up. "When the treatment is finished. When everything with my mother is resolved." He paused. "What do you want? Not what you'll accept. What you actually want." Sarah looked at him. No one had asked her that in 2 years, possibly longer. The specific question of what she wanted, not what she needed, not what was reasonable to expect, not what she could negotiate for. Given her position, what she wanted. "I want the position I should have had 3 years ago," she said. It came out more directly than she'd planned. "Royal healer, proper certification, my name on the door." Leo nodded slowly. "That's going to happen." "You can't promise that." "I'm the crown prince." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I'm allowed to have opinions about the palace's healing appointments." "You're 16. I'm a very informed 16. He held her gaze. "It's going to happen, Sarah. I'm going to make sure of it." She looked at him for a long moment, at the face that had been gray and half-transparent when she arrived and was now incrementally becoming what it was supposed to be, at the eyes that had assessed her by rank on the first day and had spent 8 weeks learning to see her differently. "Get fully well first," she said, "then have opinions." Garrett came to her room the following morning. He looked different from the last time. Not lighter, exactly. More settled. The look of a man who has done a terrible, necessary thing and is living in the aftermath of it, rather than the anticipation. "The investigation is formally opened," he said. Jesse's records have been verified by 2 independent healers. Your treatment notes have been entered as evidence." He paused. The sealed container was found in the eastern tower, in Vicky's rooms. He said her name carefully, like something he was still learning to hold at the right distance. She'd kept it. Even after... she'd kept it. Sarah absorbed this. She kept the original. She had known, in the medical stores that first week, had known that keeping it meant something about the person who kept it, the specific psychology of someone who needed to remember exactly what they'd made, or who was proud of it. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "A formal tribunal. The pack elders are being convened." He paused. "It will take time. These things..." He stopped. "I want you to know that regardless of how long the proceedings take, your restoration is not contingent on the outcome." He reached into his coat and placed a document on her work table. "That's a formal reinstatement, signed this morning, Royal Healer, full certification. Your name is back on the palace rolls." Sarah looked at the document. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something you've wanted for so long that wanting it has become more familiar than having it, and you need a moment to adjust. Then she picked it up. Her name, in the formal palace script. Sarah, Royal Healer, Palace of the Alpha King. The king's seal pressed into wax at the bottom. "There's one more thing," Garrett said. He was looking at his hands now, the same gesture she'd seen in Leo. Like father, like son, she thought distantly. "I owe you more than a document. I owe you more than a position." He looked up. "I don't know that I can give you back the 2 years. I don't know that anything I don't know do will be sufficient for what was taken from you." He paused. "But I intend to spend a considerable amount of time trying." Sarah folded the document carefully and held it. "Start with the tribunal," she said. "Make sure it's honest." She met his eyes. "Make sure what was done to Leo, and to me, is named clearly, not managed, not softened." She paused. "Named." "Yes," Garrett said. He left. Sarah stood at the work table and held the document and let herself feel, without managing it or cataloging it or putting it away after 5 seconds, what it felt like to have her name written down in a place that could not be taken from her. It felt like something she had been carrying for 2 years, slowly, finally, setting down. Epilogue. The wound, the cure, the after. 6 weeks later, Leo's marks were gone. She checked on a Tuesday morning, the last formal treatment session, which she had been moving toward for 2 weeks without saying so aloud, not wanting to make it a thing. Before it was ready to be a thing, she pressed her fingers to his forearms, his spine, the branching points at his shoulder blades, and felt nothing but clean, healthy tissue. The illness was gone, not retreating, not managed, gone. She stepped back and looked at him, fully upright, color restored, the face that had been half transparent when she arrived now entirely, undeniably itself, and felt the specific satisfaction of work completed cleanly. "Well?" he asked. "You're done," she said. Leo let out a breath, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry 8 weeks in it. Then he laughed, surprised by it, like the laugh had caught him off guard, and it was the first time she'd heard him laugh fully, without the careful rationing of someone preserving energy, and it sounded exactly like what he was. A boy who had been very sick for a very long time and was suddenly entirely not. "Does this mean I can run?" he asked. "In a week, start with walking." "That's deeply unsatisfying." "That's medicine." He grinned. The remembering compound she no longer needed. She had realized this 3 days before the final session, had applied it one morning and felt the absence of what it had been counteracting. The accumulation had metabolized completely. Her body, given sufficient time and supply, had done what it had always done, processed the thing that had been done to it, and come out the other side. She kept the last jar anyway, not to use, just to have. The specific comfort of knowing it existed, the way you keep a lamp even after the power has been restored, because you remember the dark and you respect it. She put it on the shelf above her work table in the healer's quarters. Her quarters now, with the new nameplate on the door. Sarah, Royal Healer. No family name. She had never had one that meant anything. She didn't need one. The name was enough. Paul came to her on the first day of the third week. He appeared in the doorway of her quarters, with the particular expression of a man who has spent considerable time composing something and is not confident it's sufficient. "I testified against you," he said. "You did. I believed I was acting in the palace's interest." He paused. "I was told certain things about you. I accepted them without sufficient scrutiny because they confirmed assumptions I already held." He looked at her steadily. "That was wrong. I want to say that I know it was wrong." Sarah looked at him. He was a proud man who had come to her door. Whatever it had cost him to compose those words, the cost had been real. "I know," she said. "Work well, and we won't need to revisit it." Something in his posture eased fractionally. "Right," he said. "Yes." He cleared his throat. "I have a patient with a joint complaint I'd appreciate a second opinion on." "Send them in at 2, Sarah said. He nodded and left. She looked at the door after it closed. Strange but the good kind, old Nate had told her in Eldon's Crossing. She thought about writing to him, telling him she'd found her way back to something. He would appreciate that. He was a man who understood that things that seemed finished sometimes weren't. Jesse appeared at her door in the evening with an awkward formality that made him seem younger than he was. "I wanted to know if you needed an assistant," he said. "Formally. I know you have a position now, and Paul has me in the stores, but if there was space for—" "Monday mornings," Sarah said. 8 o'clock. We'll see how it goes." Jesse's face rearranged itself into something that was trying not to be too obviously delighted. "Right. Monday, 8 o'clock. Don't be late." "I won't." She believed him. Garrett found her on the grounds one evening, walking the path that ran along the eastern wall, the part of the palace she'd never been allowed to access as an apprentice, which she now walked freely out of a principled insistence on her own access. He fell into step beside her without announcement, which had become a habit of his, not ambushing her exactly, but appearing alongside rather than summoning, the way he'd learned she preferred. They walked in silence for a while. "The tribunal reaches its conclusion next week," he said. "I know. It will be. The outcome is not in question." He paused. "It will be public." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "Leo wants to be there." "He should be." "He also wants to know if you'll be there." Sarah looked at the bare winter trees along the wall. They had been bare when she arrived. They would bud in spring. She had not let herself think about spring in this palace until recently, had kept her internal horizon short, deliberately, the way you do when you're not sure you'll be somewhere long enough for it to matter. She was letting it extend now. "Yes," she said, "I'll be there." Garrett nodded. They walked in silence until the path curved back toward the palace entrance. "My son speaks of you with considerable frequency," Garrett said. There was something in his voice, careful, exploratory, the tone of a man raising something he wasn't sure was his to raise. "He's a good patient," Sarah said. "He listened." "He does more than listen," Garrett said quietly. "He pays attention to specific things, specific people." A pause. "He's young." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "He is." "And you are." "I'm his healer," Sarah said. "That's what I am. That's what matters right now." Garrett absorbed this, nodded once with the expression of a man who has been given an answer he can accept and whose other questions can wait. "Right," he said. They went inside. The last time she saw Leo that week, he was in the library. She hadn't been looking for him, had been looking for a specific reference text that Paul's filing system had buried somewhere in the medical section, and she turned a corner and found him sitting at a long table by the window with 3 books open and his journal in front of him, and a look of complete absorption on his face. He looked up when she came in. "Healer?" he said. The word had a different quality now than it had on the first day. The first day it had been category. Now it was something closer to title, the kind given in respect rather than assignment. Patient, she returned. He grinned. I'm not your patient anymore. You're always going to be slightly my patient. I find that deeply unfair. She found the reference text on the third shelf and tucked it under her arm. She was turning to leave when he said, Sarah. She stopped. Thank you, Leo said. Not for the healing. Well, for the healing too, but mostly for coming back here when you didn't have to, for staying when it was hard. He paused. For being exactly what you are, even when this place tried to make you something less. Sarah stood in the library with the reference text under her arm and the winter light coming through the tall windows and looked at the boy who had kept a journal for her, who had stood up in the great hall on unsteady legs, who had put a blanket over her and sat on the floor and said things into what he believed was empty air. You kept the journal, she said. You needed someone to remember accurately. I know. She held his gaze. I won't forget that. She walked out of the library and down the corridor toward her quarters, her name on the door, her key in her pocket, her compounds on the shelves in their proper order. And somewhere in the middle of the walk, she understood that she was not bracing for anything. Not the way she had been since she arrived, not the specific tensed waiting of someone who has learned that good things come with expiration dates. She was simply walking down a corridor in a place where her name was on a door. She had spent 2 years becoming the wound. She hadn't known she was also becoming the cure. She pressed her fingers once against the doorframe as she entered, an old habit, the touch of someone marking something worth keeping, and went inside.
And so, dear listeners, we have come to the end of Sarah's story. A girl they stripped of her name, a wound they assumed would stay silent, a cure they never saw coming, because they never bothered to look. Here is what I want to leave with you today. The very people who rejected her needed exactly what she carried, and what they put inside her through cruelty, she turned into the thing that saved them. So let me ask you this, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments below. If the person who hurt you most suddenly needed the very thing only you could give, would you show up? Sarah did, but it cost her something real. Tell me what you think she should have done. And tell me, honestly, what you would have done. Much love. Until the next story.